Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
All right, thanks for listening to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be joined by author, pastor, and activist Doug Pagitt. Hello.
Hello, Lauren. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
In the podcast world.
Yeah. We cannot see each other face to face. We're doing this pure audio, and I have to ask, are you wearing a hat right now?
Literally wearing that hat right now. Yes.
Okay, that's what I'm going to put on
blue
my
fedora
hat.
style.
Yeah, hang on. I'm going to
turned up
my
brim
off and put on my hat.
Because I was going to. I was right on the edge of broadcasting this live on Facebook while we did the interview, because I like to do that a lot. I like to just take any of the interviews.
Oh, well, you don't have to do it. We'll have to do it the other way then, and you can be in charge.
That's right. That's right. I just reflexively sat down behind a microphone and put my hat on.
I was inspired looking at your stuff online as a balding middle-aged white man to embrace hats more.
Well, I don't know if you're interested in it, but I can give you a hat tip. I got it from a hat maker in Boston. I walked into a shop and I said, "Hey, look, this was a few years ago. I said, I want to start wearing hats. I want to become a hat guy." And this guy's serious as can be, these hat fellas. And he says, "Look." So I had said, I want to be a hat guy, so I'm looking for the right hat. And he looks at me, serious as can be, and says, "It's what's in a man's head that makes him a hat guy, not what's on a man's head."
That's great.
So there's probably a deep life lesson in there. I don't know what it would be, but at least as far as hats go, you got to first get in the mindset, because if you look for the perfect hat, you will always have that internal narrative. Because I probably spent 10 years trying to find the right hat. And then I just, made the decision. Nope, I'm going to be a hat guy. And it's a lot that goes with it. People ask the question, if you like it. It feels like the kind of thing you can't sort of do halfway and be a hat guy. Yeah. In fact, I asked a guy named Jay Baker. Do you know who Jay Baker is?
Jay Baker?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to get him on sometime.
Yeah, you should have him. Well,
you should introduce me.
We should come on together and talk about hats, because Jay has long been a hat guy. I feel like I've known and talked to Jay, in many settings for years, more than a decade. I don't think I've ever seen him without a hat on.
Wow.
So I asked him, I said this thing about, being a hat guy and all, and he confirmed. He said, "Oh, absolutely. It's a state of mind, not a state of the hat."
Profound. Well, I like to joke that I have a big head, literally and figuratively. So I have to take that into account when I shop for hats.
Well, it adds, then it makes it even better. I think any people with peculiar head situations, hat size, shape, whatever, or body size. Like I'm really tall, I'm 6'7", so I have to think about a hat in a whole different way as well. It helps because it narrows down. You're not just going to walk into any place and just grab a hat. You're like, no. There's a thing going on here, and there's a whole process that you have to go through to get that hat to fit. So take that as a sign that you're prepared to be a hat guy.
Well, look at us, like talking like we're best hat buds,
old hat buds,
and we barely even know each other.
Sitting around, chatting it up about the brims.
Believe it or not, we're here to talk about more than just hats today. For those listening,
it's a little disappointing to someone, I'm sure.
Well, Doug, I had the pleasure of meeting you a couple of years ago at a church planners conference, and have loved hearing about and reading about your work at Solomon's Porch, and then your work beyond that. But for those who don't know you, and for me, tell us about yourself besides hats.
Yeah, I live in the Minneapolis area. I've been a pastor of the church you mentioned called Solomon's Porch. Started that in 1999, so 21 years ago. And I just left my role in January of being the the pastor of that community. And Nikki Franz, a person who hails from the area where you are in Colorado, is moving here soon and will be taking on an expanded and differented role, but it assumes the role and the roles that I've had in that community for all these years. So that's a bit of a shift and change in life. To have done one thing in one place. I've done other things along with that. We've obviously, over these 20 years of doing Solomon's Porch, raised our family here. We have 4 children and 2 little grandchildren. And my wife is a yoga instructor and runs a yoga teacher training program. And I'm a long distance runner. I run ultra marathons, and I'm currently recovering from a hip replacement surgery a few years ago, and I'm still getting back my leg strength and all. So I am the worst kind of long distance runner, the frustrated long distance runner that on most days I wish I was on a 50-mile run. And I run an organization called Vote Common Good, and we exist to try to inspire, resource, and motivate faith voters, especially evangelicals and white Catholics, to stop the re-election of Donald Trump on Election Day, November 3rd. And we do that as an act of faith and as a way to call people to act justly and to love mercy and to walk in a way that is humble. So that's what I do in my, and I write books, which is some of what we're going to talk about. Or at least I've said this, I've written 10 books, and I've said this after many of them. At least I used to write books, so I don't know if I'm still writing them or not. I currently am not writing anything. So the book, Outdoing Jesus, 7 Ways to Live the Promise of Greater Than, might be the final book.
Well, hold on then. Let's not spoil it then before we get there. We're going to talk about that.
Yeah,
what does it mean? Tell me a little about your faith journey, if you would. If there's been some kind of transformation or change from your past to your current.
Yeah. I was raised in a family where we didn't have any religion at all. We never talked about it. I never went to church before I was 17. Didn't have really any construct for the Christian faith whatsoever. I didn't know anything about it. Didn't know, I didn't know Christmas and Easter had a connection to each other when I was 16. Think of a religion that you know of and know almost nothing about, and that's pretty much how I interacted with Christianity. Wow. But then I had a very life-changing experience at a thing called a Passion Play, which is one of these Easter dramas. This one was done at a Jesus People church. This is 1983, which felt like at the time a long way away from the Jesus movement. But now that I sort of look back, I realize that it was right at the tail end of the sort of late 1960s, 1970s Jesus movement. And I stumbled into this play through a friend of mine that grew up in the same apartment complex that I grew up in, and he had become a Christian and invited me to go with him. And I went knowing nothing about the Christian story at all, and just really connected with the Jesus narrative in that play, and hearing the idea that God was on the side of humanity, and that humanity was on the side of God, and that God wanted to connect with people to call them to a path of justice and of goodness. And it actually replaced in my own mind this vigilante narrative that I had that was I'd had this sense kind of growing up that you were supposed to do good, supposed to do right, supposed to protect the innocent. We're supposed to protect the weak. And I don't mean in like some moralistic sense. I've never really kind of connected to the sort of moral demands of, propriety or something like that, but a deep ethical moral demand of how people treat one another. And especially that the vulnerable and the defenseless would be defended. And what I saw in the Jesus narrative was there was a way to do that. I actually thought in the Passion Play that the culmination was Jesus, when he was crucified, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." And then it got to a resurrection, which was even more significant. And that idea that embedded in the story of God's connection to humanity is not only that God is on the side of humanity, but that there can be a way in which people are freed from the very burdens and hatred that's not only happening to them, but burning on the inside of them. So all this stuff is sort of racing around in my head, right? And so they do this altar call, which I didn't know what it was, but they just said, if this is a story that captures you, you should come down here and talk to some people. And I was sitting in the front row of the balcony and stood up. And I remember, what the Methodists would describe as that strange warming of my heart, that kind of thing. Yeah. Went down front. They kind of prayed with it. And then they brought us to the back room. And Lauren, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this part of the story and told it a lot and written about it. So I've recreated it in the landscape of my memory. But we're sitting in a big circle. There might have been 12 or 14 of us in our circle. And then there were lots of these circles, right? There were lots of people that had come backstage. And they handed out a booklet. And I think it was the booklet Steps to Peace with God, something like this, one of those types. But if you know what I'm describing here, it's one of those flat little booklets, maybe 4 inches wide, maybe 2 inches tall. And, it would go page by page with a different idea. And one of the pages in there had this chasm, like a canyon. Yeah. It has God on one side of the canyon and the shape of a human being on the other side of the canyon, and says, that humanity keeps trying to get to God. And I remember looking at this while the guy's going through it and just about wanted to say out loud to him, like, did you see the story they were telling out on that stage out there? Because the story they were telling on the stage was not a story of there being a separation between God and humanity. That was kind of the whole point, is that there's no separation between God and humanity, right? And then they had recast the story in this booklet into something else. And I have looked back on that date and realized from the first 15 minutes I was into the Christian faith, I was already fussing and fighting with people's pre-described descriptions of the story of the Christian faith that I didn't think matched not only my own experience, but also the biblical narrative. And I've just felt like for, 37 years, I've been sort of wrestling with that same dilemma of person after person handing you some version of a booklet that tells you, well, here's an explanation that just is like Freaky Friday version of the explanation of how the thing goes. It's just as backward as can be. So, and partly because I grew up in a situation where I didn't have any religious backing or religious background or religious upbringing, I never felt like I was indoctrinated into a way. And I was old enough, I was 16, almost 17. I was able to sort of look at everyone's explanation, including my own, and just say, like, I don't know, like, that's not a given. Like, everyone has an opinion about this stuff. And I find that to be very, very heartening. I mean, I think theology is fundamentally a person's opinion. And we can take it or leave it, and we can adapt it and play with it, but it's not anything more than that. And doctrine is just a theology done over time by a group of people and adhered to by a group of people rather than an individual one. So doctrine is the same way. It's a person's or a people's explanation of how things work, and sometimes they're helpful, and a lot of times they're not.
Well,
so anyway, that's how I got into Christianity. And then I was head to feet in this thing, and started my life as a provocateur and activist in Christianity right away. I got suspended from my high school the next school year for handing out Christian literature, and sued my school district for violation of my constitutional rights, and yada yada yada. And, so I've kind of been in that frame of personal faith that's good for the world and is supposed to be disruptive of systems and structures.
Wow. And it sounds like there's a lot of integration between your early faith and your current faith. Is there anything you'd say that's different?
It's curious. I've thought a lot about this, and I've talked to a lot of friends of mine that are in this kind of work, and we're older, that a lot of us had a lot of people I know had an experience with Christianity that was either new like mine or was profound for them in their teenage and late teenage years.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're doing ministry work, and they're trying, basically a lot of us, if you push us hard enough, you realize we're trying to get back to an version and expression of Christianity that matches the story that was happening in us when we first got into it.
Wow.
In fact, I did an interview with a guy named Pete Rollins, and we said the same thing. I said, Pete, I just feel like, we have very similar kinds of stories. Do you ever feel like you're kind of chasing the faith that you want to have a faith now that would have made sense to you when you were 16? And, he's had a very, very similar kinds of experiences. It's just been over and over of talking to people who have that same thing. So I think what's happened to me, at least, is that over the years, I've learned a whole lot of different versions of the Christian faith. And again, I don't think that's a problem. I think that's been the history all the way through. In fact, I think the Old Testament is a debate in the library of the Hebrew scriptures between different belief systems, vantage points, and takes from the priests and the prophets and the kings and the different tellings. And this is why you have multiple creation stories. This is why, Kings and Chronicles tell the same story from two different perspectives, because there's a debate going on about how you're supposed to understand this. And the debate in the Jewish tradition between Elohim and Yahweh. There's this thing going on. And in Christianity, that's totally happening. That's why we have 4 gospels, the Christian faith, even when it got forced into a, pigeonholed by Constantine and Augustine and all the others of the first centuries, they at least kept a collective of voices. And we know as best we can from early Christian history that around the Mesopotamian area, different Christian traditions were coming up that had their own scriptures. They may have had one of the gospels, but not all of them, or they got some letters, like people living in Corinth may have never read the book of Romans. It didn't make it to them, So you have these different expressions of Christianity. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. We now would call those different denominations or different personal experiences or different, groups. So I think that's just part and parcel. I don't have an opinion if it's a good thing or a bad thing. It just is an is thing. And, so I think it's incumbent on some of us to make our contribution in our age, in our time, of the kind of Christianity that we think people should be endeavoring to follow and to live out. And that's what I think is the call for some of us. I mean, some people become pastors or church leaders or ministry leaders, and they just buy somebody else's franchise. So they become, a Methodist or Presbyterian or a Disciples or something. And then they're like, I got it. Here it is. And some people are going to be chefs, right? And they're going to make their own restaurants. It's a question sort of facing all of us in the work, in the work that we do.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Do you have any spiritual practices that you've latched onto recently, recently, or maybe from your past that you'd recommend to others?
Yeah, I've been pushing hard into community through conversation and through bodily practices, right? So body prayer, taking your lived body experience pretty seriously. Like I'm a runner and stuff, so I incorporate that. My wife is a yogi, so she does it that way. Letting your prayers be postures as much as words, and then so essentially trying to connect with your spirituality through your body and trying to connect with other people through dialogue and through connection and through conversation, and through sharing with someone else, both in empathy and in ideas. And those are the practices that have been meaningful for me, partly because I'm an external processor and somebody likes to live in the very present moment. And, my mind, spirit, heart come open when I'm in an engagement with different people. And so, over a life, you're sort of taught other people's practices, and then you try those for a while because you think, well, I don't know. This isn't, whatever I'm doing doesn't really work well for me.
Right.
So I'm going to try this other person's idea. And it's only once you come to the grips of lowering your expectations of your own spiritual development that you ever actually make any headway in spiritual development. Like, our Christian spirituality. Yeah, I'd be glad to, because I've been thinking a lot about this. Our Christian spirituality, we gotta lower our expectations about the level of transformation and change that we're really pursuing, right? Like it's, and probably deepen into the things that we know are deep and legitimate, like pursuing justice and hope and faith and love. But all the rest of it, I mean, this idea that sort of every day or every week, Sunday by Sunday, you're going to get some new insight. You're going to get some new boost. You're going to get some new way to grow. I mean, it's a form of greed and gluttony, actually. I don't know if you're familiar with the Enneagram, but, in the Enneagram, they'll talk about how the passions are tied to what are often referred to as the deadly sins. And there's a kind of desire for spirituality that is just, it's gluttonous. It wants it more and more and more all the time. And I mean, there's even people stand up and sing songs like more God, more God, more God. You know, I mean, it kind of paces along some kind of a strange little, lovemaking sexual passion, but it's demanding that I get more and more and more. And I think what we ought to do is find ways, and this is something I think it might be a bit easier to do sort of in a later part of life, but to be able to hone that down and to say, no, I'm not going to be as greedy, and I'm going to take moments of insight, of spirituality, of love, of hope, of faith. I'm going to treat those as precious jewels that I've discovered, and I'm going to savor them rather than sort of take it and set it aside and look for another one, and take it and set it aside and look for another one. I had a friend of mine went and saw the movie Noah a long time ago. I think that rings a bell. I can't remember who was in it, but anyway, a lot of people hated the movie Noah. But the thing about that they did in this particular movie is that Noah hears from God that he's supposed to build this ark, right? And then Noah, as the biblical story says, never hears from God again. And Noah kind of goes crazy, right? Like you had one moment of clear insight, one moment of clear calling from the divine, and that was it. You didn't get one every week. You didn't get one every other day. You got one, and it sort of drove him mad, right? And I love the sort of narrative of that, right? Like could one live in one moment of clear spiritual calling? And I just think we would do better to allow our spirituality to be a bit more long lasting, a bit more lingering, and a little less grabby.
Well, I mean, just as I'm hearing you, would transform, in my mind, church as we know it.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, I'll say this as a pastor, like kind of the pressure to come up with fresh, inspiring content every week. And especially the way that, it may be fair or not, evangelical church in America over the last 20, 30 years has created this expectation of this feed me mentality.
Yep.
So, wow, that's good.
Yeah, no, it's a real thing. Like there was some joke I knew a long time ago about a pastor who got up and preached a sermon, and then the next day he got up and preached the same sermon, and the third week he got up and somebody yelled from the front row, "You're not going to preach that sermon again." And he goes, "Oh, did you figure out how to live that one already? Because if you did, I won't preach it this time." Right. Could you imagine, that thing? Because it's funny, like we just decide what things need to stay fresh and what things need to be repeats. Like if you're a music fan and you go see your favorite musician, you kind of want them to play the hits. Yeah. Right. And you go to church and you kind of want to sing familiar songs. Like you run churches like we have, people don't want to sing the same song every week. Or they don't want to sing all new songs every week. Right. They want to sing some familiar ones. But if you try to share something that's the same of what you shared last time, there's this thing about, well, we already heard that. Give us something new. What new do you have? What's something new that you have? And look, I think we should be, delving our own spiritual lives as, communities and pastors and all. But I think we should temper ourselves as somehow being a never ending vending machine dispensing great spiritual wisdom day after day.
And that really gets into the other side of the coin of when people say, "Oh, I'm not being fed." I'm sure you've heard that at some point.
Yeah, well, either you're a baby or an invalid if you need to be fed, right? So I'm not sure which. A lot of people eat; they're not fed. So if you're going to church and you're not being fed at your church, that's probably because you're not feeding yourself.
Wow, Doug, dropping some truth bombs here.
Oh, good. That's old material from my 2003 and 4 days when we started Solomon's Porch.
Well, it's good. Well, this is just the introduction, so let's move in. Let's move into your work a little bit.
I thought we were finishing up there, but okay, let's keep going.
Tell me about Solomon's Porch, the church you started. As a church planner, I'll ask you this question: like, why start a new church?
I needed a place where I could practice my own spirituality, and wanted to try it in a way with other people that were willing to experiment in a new path of spirituality. We knew that there were people who saw the world the way we did. So we knew that the struggles we had, other people had. We knew that the most significant change that happens in a person's life is when they lead, not when they not when they simply follow something. And so if you look at anyone's life and have them describe the moments of transformation, that happen in them as a human being, including their spirituality, happens when they're leading something. And the problem with churches isn't that the pews are full. The problem is that the leadership structure is full, right? So part of the reason for starting new churches is that you give a whole new group of people a chance to take a run at it. And
that's good.
And that's what we were trying to do. And I think churches should only exist for a certain length of time anyway. And then they do just over time become closed systems.
Yeah.
And so you start new churches because, the same reason you start new restaurants or new businesses or something. It refreshes the whole life and the whole process and the whole system. I'm not entirely sure churches are the best way to carry the story of Jesus in our world. Anyway, I feel like they might be an outdated modality for carrying the practices and the community and the faith that would live its way in the way of Jesus, but they're adequate. They're generally sometimes good enough. So we might as well have those be refreshed as well. And they're one of the only ways in our society that a person can frame a job or a career or a life around leading something of spirituality. The category for that is a church, or maybe a nonprofit organization, if you could, if you can work it just right. But if you're going to have a group of people go on an exploration of faith with one another in some kind of a set of regular practices and life engaged moments, well, that's kind of a church. I mean, it's pretty hard to, and I bemoan the fact that in my adult life, from 1980s through the 2020, that we haven't come up with a better way to carry that whole thing than the same old, with all the innovations that have gone on in the world. And we still are stuck with the best way for people to live their life collectively in an act of faith and goodness and justice in the world is still that same old borrowed model. So that's, I really thought, man, if you'd asked me 20 years ago, Lauren, when I was sort of in the Solomon's Porch space, time frame where you are now with Mission Gathering, if we'd been doing this interview, in some sort of time warp back then,
right.
And we had talked about 2020 because, back when we started Solomon's Porch in 1999, early 2000, every church and denomination and so on, they all had 2020 plans because it was clever, Vision 2020.
Yep.
Well, here we are, 2020. Yeah. Here we got, marches, race riots, a pandemic, an imbecile as the president of the United States that's damaging the well-being and the health of the planet and all who live on it. And churches, still kicking around doing the same old thing. So, I really would have thought, we would have more options after these 20 years, than we have. And frankly, I feel like we have less now. Back in the, not to be old manny about this, but back in the day, back in the, 90s, early 2000s, back in the previous millennium,
Yeah.
Man, there was so much going on with people thinking about structures and kinds of churches and where they would meet and how they would meet, and in bars and in restaurants and in sports teams and different configurations of them. And there was just a thing going on where conferences and books and everything was about what was emerging and what was coming and what was going to be, and that the sky was the limit and we could make anything. And man, now, geez, I don't know. Maybe you're seeing it. I don't. I'm older now, so I'm not invited maybe to the, what 20-year-olds or 25-year-olds are talking about with churches, but I would have thought I would have heard about them. And I don't think there's a lot going on. I think it's a lot of wash, rinse, and repeat, 3D printing replica stuff going on. So,
yeah, I mean, I'm in Colorado's Front Range in the Denver metro, which is like, everybody comes here to start new churches because we're so unchurched, yet it's also like a notoriously hard place to start a church.
Mm-hmm.
Yet it's the same thing. Like, it's the same thing. My associate here, he has a film studio, and he tries to work with churches, and he chuckles about how these pastors come in really doing the same thing, but trying to, in their mind, they're doing something different, but really it's just the same thing over and over again. So yeah, that's a great observation about, because you're right, that emergent church movement, if I'm understanding what you're describing, now it's 20 years old, and yeah, it's just like, start a mega church and that's it.
Yeah.
So,
and those were around back then. I used to work at one. Like, a lot of us were trying to say we want to do anything but one of those, and then a lot of people in that world with us just went off and started those. So, yeah, the force is powerful. Apparently, the gravitational pull into samenism. Yeah. So, anyway, long answer to what do we learn? What do we do? Solomon's Porch is not a model. There's didn't really birth a movement of churches built in its same modality. People are like, oh, is that the place with the couches? You're like, oh, good Lord. Seriously? Like, that's what you got out of that, Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one thing, I was interviewing Katie Hayes, which I think came from she trained with you a little bit.
Oh, I'm a Katie Hayes fan. I'm the president of the Katie Hayes fan club.
She spoke about 3 things about Next Church, and one thing she mentioned was being highly contextual, and I think that's something that's really stuck with me since our conversation. That importance of not just trying to replicate a certain model, but being really contextual. So, do you think that's something that's made Solomon's Porch really unique? Is its contextuality to its community?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there was an appropriate level of self-focused life there. And I don't mean that we were only worried about how we're doing, but we only worried if what we were doing was working for us, for our community, for our neighborhoods, for the places we lived. Didn't care if it fit anybody else. We didn't care if it matched some expectation of different traditions or denominations or orthodoxy. We were obsessively caring about, is this good for the people who are part of this community and for those who interact with the people in this community? Like, is what we're doing working for we would say every week as a benefit and blessing for the world? And so that's what we meant by contextual, right? We weren't using contextuality or missionality as a way to reach a group of people. We were trying to say, does this seem to be a legitimate expression of us as a people in this place at this time? And trying to keep away all the other pressures of how and who we should be, both our own past notions of ourselves, the ones that we brought in from our upbringing or from our childhood or from our life, in other churches. And also then the very burden that our own history was creating for us, right? One of the things you realize when you start a church is you got about, 6 months of time when there's no history haunting you. I remember, honestly, Lauren, the second week of Solomon's Porch, the second time we had a public gathering, the second one of them, somebody literally said, Well, that's unusual. We didn't do that last time. We'd only done one. Okay. But I think maybe we had 6 months before there was enough of that built up where there was some kind of a haunting, legacy and reputation hanging over us. So you have to build in a regular practice like oral health that you have to clean daily to get the residue of who you have been previously to be your fuel, like the food you consume, without being something that's sort of the limitation that holds you up and the build up on your teeth. And man, it's the one thing that a lot of church leaders ignore to their peril is your own success and reputation is that which will begin to haunt you.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. So you've kind of hinted around at this, but I need to hear it because I'm a church planner. So I need to learn. What would you say is maybe your biggest lesson you learned, or maybe the biggest mistake you made?
I don't know. There's so many. We incorporated the notion of mistakes as the most healthy thing we could do. We expected to make mistakes. We expected
like a culture
for things
of accepting failure.
Of failure, yeah. We thought it was supposed to work that way, and it doesn't take a hero to get to that level. You're just like, I don't know, that's what you do in sports. That's what you do in art. That's what you do in writing. That's what you do in all of life. Like, why do people act as if that's a major statement? So we just said, hey, we're going to fail here as much as we and other people fail in every part of life. And then we'll do something about that.
That might be just good enough. I think, especially when the stakes are high, it almost makes failure seem so much more like needing to avoid failure. Yet when the stakes are high, you almost have to try that much harder just to take risks and be willing to fail, at least from my perspective.
Well, failure, engaging failure and being willing to fail in some ways is about a deep pursuit to do something well, right? Like if you lower your expectations enough where failure's not going to happen.
Yeah.
That's a way to do it. There's a great way to not fail. There's a great way to not be embarrassed. There's a great way to not have your plans come up short and feel the disappointment. There's a great way to be sure you're never standing in that church space and looking around thinking no one's coming. There's a great way to feel like when you're driving home at night that you didn't just, do your job in a way that's going to be embarrassing to you and to anyone else if they ever tell the story of what happened at that meeting that morning or that night. Yeah, there's a lot of ways to avoid that. But those are also the things that, like, why else are you doing this? Do you really think people need your church so bad? Like, they kind of don't. I promise you, the majority of people in, name your city, the majority of people in your city, they're not going to come to your church. The majority of people in your state, nope, not going to come. In the country, nope. In fact, all the people in the world, they're not going to come to your church, right? Everyone's not going to come, save a couple of hundred or a couple thousand. Right. Even churches that are like really big deals, right? Like, we got 5,000 people. We've got 13,000 people at our church. Yeah. So what? There's 7 million people that live within driving distance of your place, or there's, 4 million people. That's a statistical zero. It is like the obsession with us thinking that we're like, up to something that has to be transformatively great for society and culture. We are all a tile in this mosaic. We're all a thread in this blanket, and we need to do our thing and make our contribution and all. But what we're doing with our churches is not trying to execute something to such a degree that the ripple effects of our moment or of our program or of our service or gathering just linger in the air. And probably only once people actually experience a high level of success are they able to say, like, okay, well, the difference between success and failure, marginal. So give it a try something, risk a little, lean in a bit, lean in over the plate.
That's great. Let's let's move on. We've been talking about hats so much that I feel like we're running out of time to talk about your book. So let's talk about your book, your most recent book. Could be your last book, right? Outdoing Jesus.
I've heard people say this. Yeah, I've heard people say this could be the last book he's ever written.
7 ways to live out the promise of greater than. So what's your goal for the book?
So the book is written around the statement of Jesus, where Jesus says, "Those who believe in me will do the works I'm doing and do even greater works than these." And that's where the notion of greater than comes from. Jesus' call that those who believe in him would do the works greater than he does. And so what I'm trying to do with the book is to introduce to some people for the first time the notion that Jesus' expectation for his followers was that they would do greater things than Jesus has done. And that phrase is exclusive in the Gospel of John. And that phrase is in response to the 7 miraculous signs that Jesus has just been credited with doing in the book of John. And then when he looks, then he talks about, and he basically says, those things I just did, those 7 miracles. And there's only 7 miraculous signs in the book of John. There's not 9 or 11 or 15. There's 7. Right. And I think they're meant to match the 7 days of creation. I think they're a creation narrative. The Gospel of John starts out with a creation poem, just as the book of Genesis. Book of Genesis has 7 days of creation, 7th on which the Lord rests. And the book of John has 7 acts of miraculous signs, the 7th of which is the rising of Lazarus. So there's a thing going on in the literary structure of John, and Jesus says, those people is outdoing the very miracles that Jesus is up to. But I think it really roots a kind of spirituality, right? The spirituality that says that Jesus is not to be understood and talked about as the miraculous exception to humanity, but rather as the magnificent rule for humanity. In other words, Jesus looks without fear of competition on humanity and those who are going to follow him in the steps of the human way. But the people are going to do what Jesus has been doing and do even greater things than these. And then theologians who've chosen to deal with this subject have debated about what is the greater than. Does that mean in frequency? Does that mean in volume? Does that mean in impact? And so what I do in the book is I suggest how each of these 7 become an archetype for how people can and should outdo Jesus, from the water to wine through the raising of Lazarus.
Wow. Now, you write about moving beyond the superhero image of Jesus. And talking theology here, we've kind of been beating around the bush. Like it makes me ask, like, are we looking at like a new Christology, a new understanding of Jesus?
Yeah, I sure hope so. I'm trying to suggest that. And step 1 is to remove the singular category of Christology.
Okay.
Right. Christology, understanding of the Christ, ought to be subsumed into anthropology.
Whoa. Okay. Yeah. Good.
But so that's sort of the first step of it, and then we could move on to some of the other theological problems that are rooted from having a separate conversation about the Christ than you do about the Spirit, than you do about God, than you do about humanity. It's the ologyification of spirituality and the Christian story that creates the problem, right? To have a study of Christ separate from the study of fill in the blank, there's the problem, right? In there lies the circumstance. But to your point, I do think we have to think about Jesus differently. And there was a super long section that that whole bit that's, I don't know, it's like 1/2 of one chapter maybe on getting rid of the superhero and the need to get rid of the superhero. Man, that was like probably written as much, almost half as much as the total length of the book on that topic. And it all got whittled down by wise editors into that little bit. But that's basically the core of the reason I'm writing the book, is trying to provide the Christian spirituality alternative to the superhero narrative. And
it's a really fascinating idea because I mean, again, I wrote in my notes, like, it feels a bit sacrilegious or irreverent, but that's apparently what you're trying to do. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Look, the first step to good Christian spirituality is sacrilege and irreverence, right?
Go on about that.
I mean, that's the whole story of Jesus, right? Jesus, he gets crucified because on the religious side, you have, one set of pressures saying he's claiming to be one with God.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, you have the political pressures of Herod and Pilate conspiring with the religious conservatives to kill the Son of God.
Yeah.
In the 21st century under the Trump administration, just as in the first century under Herod and Pilate and Jesus. But that's the whole thing, right? Is that it's the very act of sacrilege that you get to that. When Jesus said, once you take into mindset, you start reading the Gospels through the lens of heresy or sacrilege or irreverence. You're like, oh, there it is, there it is, there it is, there it is. Like when Jesus says the thing at the opening of the Sermon on the Mount and says, or in the midst of the Sermon on the Mount, you are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. That was sacrilege. People, that's what you said about the word of God. Your word is the light unto my feet.
Yeah.
The Torah is where we get the word torch in English. Right. The Torah was the light of the world. Jesus looks at people and says, you are Torah. Wow. You are the light of the world. You are the salt that will heal the world. No. The word of God would be the salt that would heal the world. In fact, the opening, I'm going to go preachy here for a second. In fact, the opening of the creation narrative in the Gospel of John basically does this. And the word became flesh, sacrilege. Right? That's the whole. And then Jesus he just keeps up with it all the time, right? He takes the water and turns it into wine, and the water that he turns into wine in the very first of the miraculous signs, and they're always referred to, by the way, as miraculous signs. They're not meaning they're pointing to something. They're pointing to a way of humanity. So the signs are there to show humanity how humanity ought to live, that we ought to live on the same path that Jesus is on, the everlasting path, the eternal path. I got a whole bit in there about, the eternal path and about belief being different than believe and all this. There's a lot in John that sort of leads to all this. I won't get into all that now. It's all in the book if people want to pick it up for $14.99 at your local retailer.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, the water that he uses for wine is the water that came from the purification jars. Like miraculous sign number 1, take the thing set aside for purification to make you ceremonially clean so that you would have a clean group and an unclean group, or a sanctified group and a sacrilege group. And that's the very container that Jesus turns into the container to hold the wine for all the people to have at the wedding. So the step number 1 in miracle number 1, make sure that thing that's set aside for religious purposes is turned into common use. In other words, sacrilege.
Wow. Yeah. Just boom, right off the bat.
Right out of the chutes. And it never stops. Right? It just keeps going. And if we think, oh, well, good, Jesus solved a problem because that was a particular Pharisee problem. And this is what I've been taught for years. Like, oh, see, what had happened was that group of people, the Jews, they got it wrong and they messed it all up. And they're the ones that perverted it. Then Jesus, the Christian, came along and fixed it. And so now we're living in the fixed world. And they were living in the broken, a world that Jesus had to fix. That's not what the Gospels are saying. No, I think what they're saying is, no, this is the kind of stuff we do. Religion comes in, takes things and tries to make some special and some not special, some ordained and some unordained, some religious and some for common use. And then the gospel wants you to go in and take all that stuff and make common use out of all of it. And I'm not suggesting that the job is to take the profane and make it holy. I'm saying the job is to take the holy and make it profane.
Wow. That's
like great. If we don't get rid of the notion of the holy, we're in trouble. If we think that the whole job is to try to say, just call everything holy. And I get what people are doing, when they want to sort of say, my church is everywhere, so everything is holy. I get that. That's a great move. I'm not bickering with that at all. As long as it's everything, right? As it becomes, well, it's some things and not all things, then you're just playing the same old game. What we probably need to do is consider everything to be common, everything, and to find the beauty in that common. I mean, if that's not the story that you see of the, away in the manger, the lowly one of God resting his head on the hay. The whole point is he's born in a friggin' manger. And the reason is he's born among the common. He's not born among the special. And then what's the first thing then we do? Make our art to put a little crown on his head, give his, put a little cherubim around him, and then immediately find a building where we can call one part of the building more special than the other. And good Lord, you just think it takes us, no time flat to do that. And we do it with clergy, we wear our little collars where we call ourselves ordained. We think we're set apart. I mean, some people even think the word church means the called out ones, the set apart ones, the ones that are set apart for special purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't mean like a utility tool. They mean like, because if it was just a utility tool that was like, a corkscrew in your kitchen drawer, then that's fine. There's not a lot you can use a corkscrew for other than, opening a wine bottle, or maybe if you got the fancy kind, you could open a beer bottle with it. But that's kind of it. So if that's what you mean, well, it's kind of useful for one particular gadget. But I don't think that's what people mean. I think what they mean is the church is the place that's set apart because it's more holy than the other places.
Wow. Well, this is great, Doug. Doug is dropping some good stuff here. Let's take a break and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Doug Pagitt. And Doug, I want to ask you can take this as seriously or not as you want to, and be imaginative here with people confine themselves to the Roman Catholic Pope, but imagine you could be like the Pope of world Christianity. Like, what's your big move if you're Pope or equivalent for a day?
I think it would be to be sure that the systems that religious people are asked, compelled, encouraged, demanded to pay attention to the systems and structures that hurt and harm people. What Paul would have referred to the Romans as the principalities and powers, the be no longer conformed to the pattern of this world, but transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that we would recognize that in addition to individual human behavior and psychology that has given humanity so much understanding of itself, we should also understand the deep systems and structures that keep people trapped and in bondage that Jesus would have referred to as setting the prisoners free, setting the captives free, and that people are a captive of mind to systems and structures that are designed and have been reinforced over years, especially for Black people in the United States, especially for indigenous people in the United States. And then its ripple effect to all other people of color, with a preference toward white people and a ever moving construct of what it means for someone to be white, because whiteness is not actually a legitimate way of viewing the world, but it's the perspective that carries so much power. So I think that would be the thing I would want to inject into religious spirituality, and especially Christian spirituality, because Christianity actually has a lot to say about that. It was born in an age of which Jew and Gentile distinctions were, a lot was being made of those, to the point that some were saved and some were not. And into that world, you get a calling for a particular way of being. Yeah.
I want to ask too, if there's a Christian, or could be non-Christian, historical religious figure or theologian you'd want to bring back to life or meet.
Well, Bruce Springsteen would be just fantastic, and Lady Gaga. If like Bruce and Lady Gaga and I could have dinner, that would make the deal. But if you get a little bit more, historic from that, I think it would be like if there was a way to sort of bump history in some time machine like way, it'd be to go back to that Augustine Pelagius arguments of the the fourth century, the late 300s, early 400s, when the church was starting to form, and when Constantine was wanting to have one religion that he could dominate his land by, and Augustine became his theologian of choice, and those who followed in the way of Augustine, and just, I don't know, sort of a bumped history enough to knock a little more Pelagius in and a little Augustine out. That would have saved the faith for a lot of people, and certainly would have saved a lot of lives.
Well, that would be a big difference. Be a big difference. So Augustine is seen as one of these pivotal figures, and throughout Christian history, we can kind of see these pivotal figures. What do you think about like our current time and place? Like, do you think there's some pivotal figure, some pivotal belief system, structure that will kind of have a historical significance as Augustine?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think so for Christian faith, only because there was a particular time in the early development of Christianity that Augustine and his cohorts had their experience inside of, and Christianity's development in the 1600, 1700 years since then has just locked it in to a way that it can't be influenced in the same way that it could have in the first 300 years, especially in that period. So I don't think so when it comes to Christian spirituality. What I do find interesting is, will we see the rise of, sort of a fourth major Abrahamic religion or not? It's a little curious that we haven't, frankly, that since the expression of Islam, or since the, if you're Muslim, since the appearance of the prophet.
The timeline for that.
Yeah, kind of been a while. Now, if we were in the 1890s, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s in the United States, the country was full of religious movements. You were pretty sure something was coming out of that. Like that turn into the 20th century there. That was, baby, those guys were fired up. I mean, you look back at your church history and you're like, what was going on back in the late 1800s? The rise of industrial age and the movement of religious traditions, and man, it was incredible. If you look at all that came out of that, and they've mostly disappeared or become domesticated. And so I'm a little surprised too that we haven't seen, in light of the internet and globalization and communication and ease of all this, and that we haven't seen a new guru and prophet sort of pop up in the scene. And maybe it's time for that. I mean, even to the point that we're now living in an age in which the Dalai Lama is like, look, I'm going to be the last Dalai Lama. We're done with this. We're done with the Dalai Lama bit. And so you're like, wow, this is really going another way. It just seems that, I don't know, maybe there's a time for a new religious movement. I would love to see a religion born out of the Jesus way that's rooted in love rather than rooted in obedience. I think that would be a real way forward. And I know a lot of people are trying to work toward that. But when you're trying to do it inside the system that's been curated for another purpose, it's really hard. It's really hard to work outside your packaging.
We have to run, but tell our listeners where they can find out more about you.
DougPagitt.com is my website, and I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram.
Well, thanks so much for your time, and peace be with you.
And also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. But hey, before you go, do us a favor, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.